Thus says the Lord, against all my evil neighbors who touch the inheritance which I have caused my people Israel to inherit, behold, I will pluck them out. The Lord goes on to share some other things. You have some significant insight into this passage as it applies to the days that we're living in and what's coming.
And what that is it's God's peace plan. God knew this would be a big deal.
God's what plan?
Mideast peace plan.
Welcome to episode 6 of the Understanding Psalm 83 video series. Thus far, we've introduced and explored Psalm 83. We've explained why it's both a prayer and a future war prophecy. We've connected the correlating peripheral prophecies as well, and identified the pre-tribulation timing of the psalm. In this installment, we're going to reveal God's Mideast peace plan. About 2,600 years ago, through the prophet Jeremiah, God issued a very compassionate and comprehensive peace plan. We'll take a look at that for the Middle East. And also reveal the various phases of Psalm 83 that have taken place thus far, and locate the present phase that we're in right now, and the final phase ultimately as well, with the conclusion of the Arab-Israeli conflict. Bible prophecy will find a final fulfillment, but in many cases, there's preparatory phases along the way. And that's been the case with Psalm 83, so we'll take a look at that. But before we do, let's talk about God's Mideast peace plan.
He knew this would be a big deal after years of desolation in Israel and warring factions back and forth. He knew that when the Jews came back into the land, it was going to be a big deal. So what he says in Jeremiah 12, is he's going to take the evil neighbors, he calls them evil neighbors, he's going to pluck them out, put them into their own lands. And he's going to take the Jews and pluck them out of those Arab lands where they had been dispersed, and bring them back into the new Israel, which 1948 was rebirthed. And he says, I'll have compassion on everyone. Each one will be brought back to their heritage. So that's the good news. That was God's land for peace deal, if you will. And after the Ottoman Empire collapsed, you saw that start to happen. The Arab states got their lands, and then Israel, of course, in 1948. So the plan is still in action, but of course everybody's oblivious to it. John Kerry is oblivious to it. All the international community, the Paris peace talks are oblivious to it. But what he says is this. He goes, so I'm going to do that, and I'm going to have compassion on everyone, the Arabs and the Jews, because he's a loving God. Okay? He says, and if you worship me like you taught my children to worship Baal, which is when Jeremiah wrote, that was through the southern kingdom of Judah started idolatry. They were sacrificing their babies to the pagan god of Baal. He says, if you worship me, thus says the Lord who's alive, he says, then I will have compassion on you. But he says this, if you do not, I will utterly pluck up and destroy that nation. See, this is the severity of this situation. Those countries are not worshiping him. They're worshiping Allah. And they are anti-Israel. And they're going to be plucked up and destroyed. And I believe that's part of the Psalm 83 and these other peripheral prophecies. If you read those passages closely, that is what, when I was on Marcus and Joni Daystar TV, they asked me a question when John Kerry was doing his final stages of the peace talks back, I think it was in 2014 or whatever it was. What would you tell John Kerry if you were in front of him? I said, I would tell him that verse right there. That is God's peace plan, and that's what God has planned. That those people need to worship God, not Allah, and God has compassion on them if they will do that. He's a loving God. But if they don't, they're going to be utterly plucked up and destroyed. It's plain, it's simple, it's to the point, and it's fair. It's just.
In order to grasp a better understanding of God's Mideast peace plan, let's take a look at the actual text in Jeremiah chapter 12, verses 14 through 17. We'll separate it into two parts. Read on the left-hand side with me. Part 1 says, Thus says the Lord against all my evil neighbors. Notice he's not calling the Arab states surrounding Israel as friendly neighbors, but they're evil neighbors, who touch the inheritance which I have caused my people Israel to inherit. Behold, I will pluck them out of their land, and pluck out the house of Judah from among them. And it shall be after I have plucked them out, that I will return, and have compassion on them, and bring them back, everyone to his heritage, and everyone to his land. So it's a compassionate plan, inclusive for both the Arabs and the Jews. With the collapse of the Ottoman Empire in 1917, we see God's plans start to take effect as the Arabs get their statehood again. Egypt, 1922, Saudi Arabia and Iraq, 1932, Lebanon 1943, Syria and Jordan 1946, and Israel in 1948. Okay, so let's look at part 2 of God's peace plan, and in so doing we'll find the sole request that the Lord asks of these evil neighbors. And it tells us in verse 16 and 17, it says, "And it shall be, if they, the Arabs, will learn carefully the ways of my people, to swear by my name," that's Jehovah, not the false god Allah, "as the Lord lives, as they taught my people to swear by Baal, then they shall be established in the midst of my people." Let's stop there for a moment. He's simply saying, with the same zeal that the Jews at the time of Jeremiah worshipped Baal, turn that devotion toward the God of the Bible, Jehovah. That's all he's asking in return for all that he's doing for them, to bring them back into their own land and heritages. But the caveat is, it says, "But if they do not obey, I will utterly pluck up and destroy that nation." Now, I've written an article on Jeremiah's prophecy entitled God's Middle East Peace Plan, which you can access at our website, prophecydepot.com, under the article section. Let's turn our attention now to the various phases of Psalm 83. Let's reveal them. I'm often asked if I think Psalm 83 is taking place, and my answer is I believe we're at the final phases of Psalm 83, but the final fulfillment is still yet future. Now, I said at the onset of this episode that a Bible prophecy will find its final fulfillment, but along the way there can be preparatory phases that let us know the final fulfillment is forthcoming. And historical example of that, we'll turn our attention to the 3 phases of deportation of the Jews from Judah into the Babylonian captivity. Look at Jeremiah 25 to look at the prophecy specifically. We're told in verse 1 it's concerning the people of Judah. Verse 9 tells us, "So I, the Lord, will send my servant, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon. I will bring them against this land," that's Judah, "and its inhabitants, and all the nations that surround it. I will utterly destroy the land, its inhabitants, and all the surrounding nations." Verse 11 tells us this whole area will become a desolate wasteland. These nations will be subject to the king of Babylon for 70 years. It's important to take a look at the specific details of this prophecy. The whole land of Judah is going to become a desolate wasteland at the fulfillment of this. And the surviving inhabitants are then going to be subject to the king of Babylon for 70 years. So we see that in the 3 phases, the first deportation occurred in 606 BC, phase 1. And in that deportation, some royal youths, including the prophet Daniel, and some of his companions were relocated into Babylon. That was phase 1. Phase 2 is around 588 BC, the second deportation, and many more principal Jews were moved into Babylon. The first Jewish temple was destroyed at that time, and the Babylonians confiscated many of the holy vessels from the temple at that time. Then the final fulfillment came in the third deportation, 582 BC, the final deportation, and many heads of families, their wives and children, were exiled into Babylon as part of the final fulfillment, and that's when the land of Judah became a desolate wasteland. Okay, so we see historically that the fulfillment of the 70-year captivity prophecy in Jeremiah 25 was fulfilled through 3 different phases of deportation. Now let's turn our attention to Psalm 83 to look at the phases that have been taking place in modernity. Remember, the modern-day mantra of the Arab states surrounding Israel, who are the evil neighbors, that we talked about in God's Mideast Peace Plan, Jeremiah 12. Their mantra, modern-day mantra, is from the river to the sea, meaning the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea, Palestine will be free, which is exactly what the goal of the Confederacy of Psalm 83 it talks about in verse 4. They have said, "Come and let us cut them off from being a nation, that the name of Israel may be remembered no more." So the start of this first phase, I believe, happened phase 1 in 1947 in Resolution 181, the Partition Plan.
The growing tensions between Jews and Arabs, which the Britain struggled to resolve, eventually led Britain to hand the issue of Palestine to the newly formed United Nations in 1947. The UN proposed the partition plan that aimed to divide the region into 2 independent states, a Jewish one and an Arab one, For the Jewish side, this plan was a major step towards long-awaited dream of a Jewish state.
The Jewish people at once began to celebrate the United Nations decision.
Israeli leaders accepted the plan. The Arab leadership, on the other hand, rejected the plan outright, viewing it as unjust, particularly given the land distribution. They argued the partition plan was unfairly biased in favor of the Jewish population. The plan proposed to allocate 55% of land to the Jewish state, even though Jews constituted about 1/3 of the population and owned only 7% of the land. On the other hand, the Jewish community saw this rejection as a refusal to acknowledge Jewish right to self-determination, deepening the divide between the two groups and setting a stage for further conflict. On May 14, 1948, as the British mandate expired, Jewish leadership seized a historic moment, declaring the establishment of the State of Israel. This was immediately met by resistance. Neighboring Arab countries, Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq, invaded newly formed Israel, sparking the 1948 Arab-Israeli War.
So we see from the very inception of the rebirth of the nation of Israel at the United Nations that the evil neighbor Arab states formed into a league to conspire against our even being in Israel in the first place. In fact, the vote, we see in the New York Times here, Assembly votes Palestine partition. Margin is 33 pro and 13 against, and the Arabs actually walked out. So who are the 13 that opposed this? They're the evil neighbors. You see here you had Egypt, and Iraq, Lebanon, Saudi Arabia, Syria. Jordan was not admitted into the United Nations until 1955, but of course they would have voted in opposition as well. So we see that probably the very first phase we can put our fingers on would be the UN Resolution 181, the partition plan, back in 1947. Unsettled by the thought that there'd be no more Palestine, the evil neighbor Arabs went together to formulate Plan B over the next 6 months. If they can't stop the legislation of the Jewish state, they figured they could at least stop the creation of the Jewish state by going to war with them, which is exactly what they did in the 1948 War of Independence, Phase 2.
Israel officially declaring its independence triggered a tipping point. Arab forces from Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq marched to Palestine. This was the first time the Arab League was formed. And for what? To protect Arab Palestine. To put it into context, the Arab states had just recently declared their own independence from colonial powers. So Arab nationalism was on the rise. The armies of the Arab League launched an attack, and in just a few weeks, Israeli forces were surrounded, facing a possible defeat. That's when the UN intervened with a 4-week ceasefire, which worked in favor of Israel. Ignoring the UN arms embargo, Israel imported heavy armaments from Czechoslovakia and used the time to reorganize. This brings us to a turning point in the history of the war. As soon as the ceasefire was over, Israel launched a counter-offensive, occupying 2 strategic Arab towns which were allocated to Arab Palestine by the UN. 70,000 Palestinians who lived there were forced to flee. The Israelis closed in and continued occupying the areas allocated to the Palestinians. And the Arab armies were not as effective as they were in the first round of fighting. There was little coordination and virtually no cooperation, says Avishlam. What did the First Arab-Israeli War bring? An Egyptian military presence in the Gaza Strip, and Jordan was gifted the West Bank as a token for its loyalty to Britain and the Zionists. Meanwhile, 700,000 Palestinians were driven out of their homeland. And the UN's 2-state solution? Well, it never saw the light of day. It's been 70 years. The crisis of this catastrophe continues.
So the Arabs were defeated, but let's take a look at the belligerents who conspired together in a Confederate effort to prevent the nation of Israel from being created. The Arab League involved Egypt, the Palestine Protectorate, Transjordan, which is modern-day Jordan, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Saudi Arabia. These all happen to be the evil neighbors talked about in Jeremiah chapter 12. As a result of the failed war on behalf of the Arabs, you had the refugee crisis beginning. Here's a picture of the Arabs who had to flee from that war, who were formerly living in what was once known as Palestine. Now they became refugees dwelling in tent communities. Here's a picture of some of them in Jordan in 1949. I believe that's when the creation of the tents of Edom happened, as is part of Psalm 83, verse 6, part of that Arab Confederacy. Some teach that the War of 1948 actually fulfilled Psalm 83. They line up the nations of Psalm 83 and realize that the same countries involved that we just looked at, the Arab countries involved in the War of 1948. But we're going to see there's more phases to follow, which mitigates against that possibility. It's just like the first deportation of the Jews into captivity from Judah was not the fulfillment of the Babylonian captivity prophecy of Jeremiah 25, but just merely a phase among three phases. So the same thing with Psalm 83. It's not found final fulfillment, as the upcoming phases we're going to talk about will demonstrate. The next phase of Arab aggression came just merely 8 years later, after the War of 1948, in 1956, in the Suez Crisis. Now, the Suez Canal is a man-made marvel connecting the Mediterranean Sea with the Red Sea. And in that crisis, we find out 1956 was a brief failed military invasion of Egypt by Israel, Britain, and France in the late 1956, triggered by President Gamal Nasser's nationalization of the Suez Canal. Pressure from the U.S. and USSR forced the Allies to withdraw, solidifying Egypt's control and marking the decline of the British and French colonial power. But there was another act of aggression there as they nationalized the Suez Canal. Then 11 years later, Phase 4 happened in 1967 in the Six-Day War, when Israel successfully took over East Jerusalem, the Golan Heights, Sinai, and the Gaza, nearly tripling its size.
On May 13, 1967, Soviet intelligence informed Egypt that Israeli forces were building up near the Syrian border. The following day, the symbol of Arab nationalism, Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser, ordered 130,000 Egyptian troops to move into the Sinai Peninsula along Israel's borders. The intent was to prevent an invasion of Syria, rather than to attack Israel. As tensions escalated on May 16, Nasser ordered the withdrawal of UN peacekeeping forces from Sinai. 6 days later, the Egyptian president closed the Taran Straits, blocking ships from entering Israel's port of Eilat. Confident of their military superiority, Egyptian and Arabs celebrated Abdel Nasser's actions. What they didn't know was that Israel's army was better equipped and ready for war. In Israel, the media compared the Arabs to the Nazis, triggering memories of the Holocaust and fueling anti-Nasser sentiments. Fearing war, US President Lyndon Johnson warned both sides not to be the first to strike. The Egyptian-led Arab powers, fearing a US invasion, stood down. To their surprise, on June 5th at 7:45 a.m., the well-rehearsed Israeli aerial assault Operation Focus kicked off. By midday on June 5th, 200 Israeli jets had struck 18 Egyptian airfields, destroying more than 80% of the country's air force, before they even managed to get off the ground. However, Cairo made fake announcements claiming an Egyptian victory to rally its Arab neighbors to join the war effort. Syria, Jordan, and Iraq followed suit and started deploying their air forces to strike Israeli targets. But on the same day, Israel quickly destroyed all of their airfields as well, achieving complete air superiority. Despite not having any air support, the Egyptian soldiers held their defenses in Sinai against the Israeli incursion. Meanwhile, Jordan, under the leadership of King Hussein, had started a small offensive and had reached the hills overlooking southern Jerusalem. But by June 6th, Egyptian Field Marshal Abdel Hakim Amir, having witnessed the might of Israel's air force, ordered the full retreat of Egypt's army from Sinai. Jordan, realizing the severity of Egypt's humiliating retreat, decided to pull back from its positions after minor clashes with the Israelis. By Wednesday, June 7th, Israel had successfully taken over the Jordanian-administered East Jerusalem and West Bank. By the fourth day of the war, Israel had reached the Suez Canal, with full control of the Egyptian-administered Gaza Strip and the entire Sinai Peninsula. Having demolished the Jordanian and Egyptian armies, Syria was now on its own. On the fifth day of the war, Israel ascended the strategic Golan Heights. Syrian soldiers fought the Israeli forces. However, similar to their Egyptian allies, they were let down by the decisions of their leaders. Hafez al-Assad, then defense minister, accepted a UN ceasefire, undermining the ongoing military resistance. By the sixth day of the war, Israel accepted the UN ceasefire as well. But the damage had been done. and the Middle East would never be the same.
Then 7 years later, Phase 5 kicked off in the 1973 Yom Kippur War.
As Yom Kippur was observed by Jews worldwide, Israel was attacked on October 6, 1973, at the hands of an Arab coalition at the command of Egypt and Syria. The attack stunned Israel and immediately galvanized the state to strike back. Israeli Prime Minister Golda Meir had made the controversial decision to not launch a preemptive strike against the coalition. The Soviet Union and the United States began another diplomatic showdown, with the Arab states receiving Soviet arms and Israel receiving American support. Although the Arab coalition had made early gains, it suffered a humiliating defeat at the hands of the IDF on October 25, 1973, with Israel occupying the Golan Heights and areas west of the Suez Canal, although Egypt occupied a few eastern swaths.
It is an all-out war. That's how Israeli Defense Minister Moshe Dayan describes an invasion of the Golan Heights and the east bank of the Suez by Syria and Egypt. The surprise attacks came early this morning in the air and on the ground. The Egyptians apparently have taken control of at least a portion of the east bank of the Suez. Dayan says it would take several days to drive them out of there, attributing the initial Egyptian successes to the thin line of Israeli defenses in that area. Egypt maintains it has taken control of the entire beach. On the Golan Heights, Syria claims it has taken some Israeli positions, but Israel says the Syrian attack now has been brought under control. As usual, there are conflicting reports on the casualties. Moshe Dayan called Israeli casualties reasonable. Egypt announced that it had lost 10 planes, but that it shot down 11 Israeli planes. Everyone agrees that this is the most serious fighting in the area since the Six-Day War of 1967.
Then came a string of conflicts and aggressions. I'm going to call them Phase 6 plus. The 1982 Lebanon War was a major conflict aimed at destroying the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, who had bases in southern Lebanon. And you had the Palestinian Intifadas, two of them. The first one, 1987 and 1993. The second one in the year 2000. Then the 34-day conflict between Hezbollah and Israel in 2006, whereby Hezbollah allowed about 4,000 missiles in 34 days, averaging about 100 per day, in the northern cities into Israel. Then more recently, we had Phase 7 kickoff on October 7th, 2023, with that Hamas massacre.
It began Saturday morning with a massive rocket barrage from Gaza striking across Israel.
In the early hours of Saturday, October 7th, Israelis in the south of the country huddled in basements and bomb shelters. They listened as Hamas militants went house to house in their neighborhoods, brutally killing civilians of all ages and taking hostages.
Then on the very next day, October 8th, came Phase 8, when Hezbollah joined the Hamas in their assault, Hezbollah from the north.
Tensions are also rising in the north with a potential second front in the war along Israel's border with Lebanon. CBS's Imtiaz Tayeb is following the action where Israeli troops exchanged fire today with Hezbollah forces.
Israel was thrown into a fresh state of terror after a military alert warning of a, quote, aerial infiltration from Lebanon. An army spokesman later said it was an error. But on its northern border with Lebanon, Israel is taking no chances. CBS News has witnessed a mass mobilization of tanks and soldiers following 4 consecutive days of incoming rocket fire from southern Lebanon.
Allahu Akbar!
Dozens of northern Israeli communities have already been evacuated. The few who remain, mainly women and children, spend most of their time in underground bunkers because of the near constant air raid sirens.
So then when will Psalm 83 find final fulfillment? Well, we don't know how many more phases there's going to be, but we have to be drawing near to the final phase of Psalm 83. And when that happens, 3 major prophecies will find fulfillment. See, Zechariah 12:6 tells us that there'll be a final war with the Arabs and the Jews, and we're told that the IDF will devour all the surrounding peoples, the evil neighbors on the right hand and on the left. And when that happens, it'll fulfill Ezekiel 28:26, where it says, they, Israel, will dwell securely when I execute judgments on all those evil neighbors around them who despise them. And Jeremiah 12:17 we read earlier, but if they do not obey, I will utterly pluck up and destroy those evil neighboring nations. Now, I showed several slides at the end of episode 5 talking about how the Arab-Israeli conflict will conclude. But in order to support what I just talked about on Zechariah 12, Ezekiel 28, and Jeremiah 12, I think they're worth repeating for you. The time's going to come in Zechariah 12:2 where the Arabs are going to make a final siege on Judah and against Jerusalem. And at that time, it'll become a cup of trembling. The Lord will make it a cup of trembling to them. And ultimately, when they do that, it'll force the conclusion whereby the Israeli Defense Forces, the captains of Judah in Zechariah 12:6, become like a fire pan in the woodpile, and like a fiery torch in the sheaves, and they shall devour all the evil neighbors. The surrounding peoples on the right hand and on the left. But Jerusalem shall again be inhabited in her own place, Jerusalem. Those neighbors on the right hand and on the left, you know, they're part of the 1948 war and all these phases we've been going through. You see them listed up there. The evil neighbors. Ezekiel 28 calls them a pricking briar, a painful thorn that doesn't allow Israel to dwell safely, build houses, and plant vineyards. But ultimately, after Zechariah 12:6 and the final fulfillment of Psalm 83, those nations, the pricking briar, will no longer be a problem. They'll be utterly plucked up and in many cases destroyed. Ultimately, in the final phase of Psalm 83, when it finds final fulfillment, in tandem with Zechariah 12:6, Ezekiel 28:26, Jeremiah 12:17, we'll also find the fulfillment of Psalm 83, verses 16 through 18. Asaph's petition will be concluded where it says, "Fill their faces with shame, that they may seek your name, O Lord. Let them be confounded and dismayed forever. Yes, let them be put to shame and perish, that they may know that you, whose name alone is the Lord, are the Most High over all the earth." They don't know that yet. They're worshiping Allah, not Jehovah. They're out of compliance with God's roadmap plan. This has not happened yet, but it is coming, folks. In the next episode, Lord willing, I hope to accomplish and answer the objections to Psalm 83 as a future pre-tribulation war prophecy that you see up here on the screen. We'll be trying to tackle those in the final episode of this series.